Hello and welcome back. Now we're ready to create a projectile class. Now our tanks and our towers need to fire projectiles, which means we're going to need a C++ class for the projectile. Now the projectile is going to need its own static mesh so that we can see the projectile once we spawn it in the world. So we're going to create the C++ class, and then we'll create a blueprint based on this class. And this is going to be a challenge for you since these are all things that you already know how to do. So you're going to create a new C++ class and choose the correct parent class. Now the projectile doesn't need to handle any user input, so that should tell you right there that this is not going to be a pawn. Now once you've done this, add a static mesh variable, just like we've done for our other classes. Construct it in the constructor using createDefaultSubObject and set the static mesh as the root component. Now, once you're done, go ahead and create a blueprint based on this projectile class. And in the blueprint, set the static mesh property for the static mesh component. Pause the video and create the projectile class now. Okay, so we're ready to create the projectile C++ class. So I'm going to go to File, New C++ class, and because we don't need user input, this is just going to be a basic actor. An actor can be placed in the world or spawned in the world, and we're going to be spawning these in the world, so we need to derive from the actor class. I'm going to click Next and name this new class. Now this is a projectile, so I think projectile is a perfect name for this. I'm going to leave it in the same folder as all our other C++ classes and click Create Class. So here we have projectile.h and projectile.cpp, and we need to add a static mesh variable. So I'm going to add a private section just under the protected one. So private, and we're going to need a uStaticMesh component. So this will be a uStaticMesh component. It's going to be a pointer. Now that's okay if you named it something different. I'm going to call this projectile mesh. Now we're going to expose this using uProperty. So uProperty, and I'd like to be able to edit this from the default blueprint. So I think edit defaults only is appropriate for this. I'm going to give it a category, and the category can be combat. It's not really important what we call it. And that's all the exposure I'm going to give this variable. That's okay if you have different uProperty settings here. Now we need to construct this, so let's go into projectile.cpp into the constructor and say projectile mesh, and we're going to call createDefaultSubObject using uStaticMesh component. And for the text, I'm just going to say projectile mesh. And finally, we need to set this to be the root component. So I'm going to say root component equals projectile mesh. And I'm going to spell it correctly there. Okay, so that takes care of the C++ side of things. Now, you may not have thought of this, but we have this primary actor tick, B can never tick equals true. And because our projectile doesn't really need to tick, we can set this to false. So if you'd like, go ahead and set that to false along with me here. And we do get the red squiggles here under the assignment operator. And this is simply because we need to include the header file for uStaticMesh component. So if we go to basepawn.cpp, we can see that header file here because we needed to include it for the static mesh components in the base pawn. So I'm going to steal that include and paste it right here at the top. And that way, uStaticMesh component is defined. Now let's go ahead and compile this. And I'm back here in the editor, and the next thing we need to do is create a blueprint based on projectile. Now I'm going to go into the blueprints folder, and we have a pawns folder. I'd like to create a new folder and call this actors because our projectile is not a pawn, so it doesn't really need to go into the pawns folder. So we have a new actors folder. I'm going to go into it, and this time I can right-click and select Blueprint Class. And here we can select the class to base this blueprint on. If we click the drop-down next to All Classes, then we can search for Projectile. And there is the Projectile class. So I'm going to select that, click Select, and now we have a new blueprint based on the Projectile class. So that's another way to create a blueprint based on one of our C++ classes. Now I'm going to call this BP underscore projectile. And I'm going to double click to open up BP projectile. And I'll click open full blueprint editor. If you see that, go ahead and click on it. And we have our blueprint. And here's projectile mesh. And by default, it doesn't have its static mesh property set. So we're going to set that, and I'm going to choose the SM projectile. I'm sure that is what you selected for your projectile. Makes sense. So we have a projectile. Excellent. I'm going to compile and save this, close out of it, and click Save All just to make sure everything is saved. And we now have a projectile. So in summary, you have created your projectile class, and you created a blueprint based on projectile and gave it a uStaticMesh component variable, and in the blueprint, you set its static mesh, so now we have a projectile to work with. We're ready to start spawning these things, and we're going to take care of that in the next video. I'll see you soon.